Elias Croft pressed the barrel of his revolver against his own temple and closed his eyes. His hand didn't shake. That was the worst part, how steady his hand was, how certain his body had become about something his soul still fought against. The infection in his leg had won. The war had won. Everything had won except him. Then a small voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Mister, whatever you're about to do, don't." He opened his eyes. A barefoot girl stood 10 feet away, watching him like she'd seen this before and wasn't going to let it happen again. Before we go any further, if you're watching this from anywhere in the United States or around the world, drop your city name in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and stay until the very last word, because what happens next is going to remind you that second chances are real, and they don't always look the way you expect them to. The girl didn't run. That was the first thing Elias noticed. Any child with good sense would have turned and fled the moment they spotted a half-dead man with a pistol pressed to his own skull. But this one just stood there in the dirt, her feet bare despite the sharp October cold. Her yellow hair tangled around her face, her eyes fixed on him with an expression that had no business living in a child's features. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something closer to recognition, like she'd been walking this stretch of Colorado Trail specifically to find him. And now that she had, she intended to see the matter through. "I asked you not to do that," she said. Elias lowered the gun slowly. Not because he wanted to, because something in her voice made his arm move before his mind agreed to it. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. His voice came out wrong, cracked and dry, like a man who hadn't spoken to another human being in 2 weeks, which was more or less the truth. "Where's your people?" "Over the ridge." She tilted her head. "Where's yours?" The question landed like a boot to the chest. Elias looked down at the revolver in his hand. He set it on the rock beside him carefully, the way you put down something you might need to reach for again. "Don't have any," he said. "Not anymore." The girl studied him, the way children study things they're trying to understand fully before committing to an opinion. She looked at the makeshift bandage wrapped around his thigh, soaked through with something dark and foul-smelling. She looked at the way his hands trembled. She looked at his face, and whatever she found there made her take one step closer instead of one step back. "That leg's going to kill you before morning," she said. "I know." "Were you going to let it?" Elias didn't answer. She nodded slowly like he'd said something instead of nothing. "My mama can fix it. She fixed a man once who'd been bit by a rattler so bad his whole arm went black. He was mean and ungrateful and didn't deserve the trouble she took, but she fixed him anyway." She paused. "She'll fix you too if I ask her right." "Your mama doesn't know me." "No." The girl crossed her arms over her thin chest. "But she knows me, and I'm asking." Elias looked at her for a long moment. The sun was dropping fast behind the western ridgeline, turning the sky the color of old blood. He had maybe 2 hours of light left, and less than that of useful consciousness. The fever had been climbing all afternoon, turning the edges of his vision soft and strange. He knew the mathematics of his own dying. He'd been doing the calculations for days. "What's your name?" he asked. "June Hartwell." She stuck out her hand with the formality of someone twice her size. "I'm 10 years old, and I can read anything you put in front of me. What's yours?" He shook her hand. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "Elias Croft." "Well, Mr. Croft?" She released his hand and looked at him steadily. "You got 2 choices. You can sit here and finish what you were starting, or you can come with me and let my mama decide if you're worth saving." She paused. "But I already decided you are, so I'd appreciate it if you'd get up." Elias Croft had survived Antietam. He'd survived 3 winters scouting the Wyoming Territory. He'd survived a Comanche ambush that killed 4 better men than him, and a cattle stampede that should have taken his legs off at the knee. He had not survived all of those things to be undone by a barefoot 10-year-old in the Colorado backcountry. He picked up the revolver and holstered it. Then he grabbed the split-rail fence behind him and hauled himself upright, and the world tilted hard to the left, and he set his jaw and waited for it to stop tilting. Lean on me, June said, moving to his side without being asked. You're not big enough. I'm bigger than you think. She wedged herself under his arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before or something like it. And you're not as heavy as you look. Come on, it's not far. It was far. Every step sent fresh fire up through Elias's infected thigh and into his hip and spine. The fever made the distance elastic. Sometimes the ridge seemed close enough to touch, and sometimes it receded like a mirage. But June kept talking, her voice a steady anchor in the gathering dark, and so he kept walking. We got 4 horses and a milk cow named Biscuit, she said, steering him around a boulder. Don't let the name fool you. Biscuit's got a temper like a wet cat. Kicked Mama in the shin last month and left a bruise the size of my fist. She adjusted her grip. We got chickens too. 16 of them, though the foxes keep making that number smaller no matter what we do. How long you been out here? Elias managed. Talking kept him conscious. He focused on her words the way a drowning man focuses on a rope. 4 years, since Papa died. Her voice didn't break on the words, but it went careful around them, the way you go careful around something sharp you've learned to navigate. Mama filed the land claim herself, built half the fencing herself, hired 2 men to help with the heavy work, but they left come winter. A beat. Most people leave. Why'd you stay? June considered that. Because Mama doesn't quit, and because I don't either. She glanced up at him. You strike me as someone who doesn't quit either, Mr. Croft, even when you're trying to. Elias had nothing to say to that. The Hartwell homestead appeared over the ridge in a wash of warm lamplight that hit Elias somewhere behind his sternum, and made the thing in his chest that had gone quiet in recent months stir briefly back toward life. It was small, a log house, a barn listing slightly east, a chicken coop with a mended roof, a kitchen garden bordered by river stones. But someone had fought the wilderness for every inch of it. Someone had refused to let it go. Mama. June's voice cut through the evening air. Mama, come out. I brought someone. The door opened. Adelaide Hartwell stepped onto the porch, and even through the gauze of fever and failing light, Elias could see the rifle she was holding. She'd brought it out, already loaded, already aimed low, in the practiced way of a woman who'd learned to answer unknowns from a position of readiness. She was tall for a woman, lean in the way of people who work without stopping, with dark hair pulled back tight, and eyes that caught the lamplight and threw it back like copper wire. Those eyes dropped to Elias, and they did not soften. June. Her voice was controlled, but only barely. What have you done? He needs help, Mama. His leg's infected bad, and he's burning up with fever, and I found him by the old Cutter's Creek crossing, and he was about to... She stopped. Recalculated. He needs help. Adelaide's eyes had already moved back to Elias. They traveled over him with the clinical thoroughness of a woman who'd learned to assess threats quickly. Former soldier, her expression said. Dangerous. Armed. Your cavalry, she said flatly. Elias noticed her grip on the rifle didn't change. Was, he said. Discharged 18 months back. Discharged or deserted? Discharged, honorable. He paused. Whatever that's worth. In my experience, Adelaide's jaw tightened. Not a damn thing. She looked at her daughter. June, go inside. Mama. Now. June didn't move. She stood her ground with her chin up and her bare feet planted in the dirt like roots, and she looked at her mother with an expression that was equal parts plea and challenge. You always say we don't get to choose who needs help, she said. You say we only get to choose whether we give it. Something moved across Adelaide's face. Gone before Elias could name it. That's not the same situation. How is it different? June, Mama. June's voice had gone quiet, steady. He was going to die out there. Maybe not from the leg. He was going to die out there, and I couldn't leave him. She looked up at her mother without flinching. I couldn't leave him the way people left us. The silence that followed lasted long enough for a whippoorwill to start and stop its song in the dark. Adelaide stood on the porch with her rifle, and her grief, and her very good reasons to say no, and she looked at her daughter, and Elias watched the battle play out across her face with the slow inevitability of a tide coming in. "Barn," she said finally. "Put him in the barn. I'll get my kit." "Thank you, Mama. Don't thank me. I haven't decided anything yet." Adelaide disappeared back inside the door, shutting behind her with a firmness that was not quite a slam. June exhaled beside Elias. "She's going to help you," she said quietly. "She said she hasn't decided." "That's what she says when she's already decided and she's just mad about it." June steered him toward the barn. "Come on, it's warmer in here." The barn was dim and smelled of hay and horse, and the particular dusty warmth of animals in a closed space. Elias sank onto a hay bale and let his head drop back against the wall and let the world go sideways for a moment, just one moment before he pulled himself back. June lit a lantern with practiced hands. The horses shifted in their stalls. An old hound dog in the corner lifted its head to look at Elias with complete disinterest, then put it back down. Adelaide came in 5 minutes later with a basin of water, a leather kit, and an expression that said she'd argued with herself the entire walk from the house and lost. "You," she said to June, "sit in that corner and don't speak unless I ask you something." "Yes, ma'am." Adelaide set the basin down and looked at Elias's leg with her hands on her hips. "When'd you take the wound?" 8 days ago, arrow. I pulled it myself." 8 days. She crouched down and unwrapped the bandage without ceremony, and the smell that came off it made even her jaw clench just slightly. "You should be dead already." "I've heard that before." "From who?" "Doctors mostly." Adelaide looked up at him. For just a fraction of a second, something crossed her face that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite anything else Elias could name. Then she looked back down at the wound. "This is going to hurt worse than anything you felt today," she said. "I've had worse." "No." She opened the kit and reached for the whiskey bottle inside it. "You haven't." She was right. Elias clenched his teeth against the sound that wanted to come out of him when the alcohol hit the wound, and he mostly succeeded, and that mostly was the best he could do. He'd been shot before. He'd been cut before. He'd had a regimental surgeon dig a bullet out of his shoulder with a tool that was barely a step up from a kitchen fork. None of it was like this. "Hold still," Adelaide said, and her hands were merciless and precise, working through the wound with an efficiency that left no room for mercy or hesitation. She knew what she was doing. She'd done it before. He didn't know when or how or on whom, but the certainty of those hands was unmistakable. "Thread," she said to June. June appeared at her mother's elbow with thread and needle, her face pale but steady. "You all right?" Elias asked the girl. "I've seen worse," June said, and then stopped and added quietly, "almost." When it was done, Adelaide sat back on her heels and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and looked at her work with the critical eye of someone who expected better from themselves than they usually managed to deliver. "I've cleaned it as well as I can," she said. "The fever'll break or it won't. If it doesn't break by morning—" She stopped. "Then I'll be dead by morning," Elias said. "You can say it. I've made my peace with it." "Have you?" It wasn't a question. Her eyes came up to his, and this time they stayed there, and the look in them was something he hadn't expected. Not contempt, not pity. Something more complicated than either. "My husband made his peace with dying too," she said. "Told me not to grieve too long, said I'd be all right." A beat. "He was wrong about that last part." "I'm sorry about your husband." "Are you?" Still not a question. "Yes, ma'am. My husband's name was Robert Hartwell," Adelaide said. "He died 2 miles from here 4 years ago when a company of cavalry decided his wagon looked suspicious and didn't bother to ask any questions before they started shooting." She held his gaze without any expression on her face at all. "They said it was a mistake. They said they were very sorry. They were very sorry, and Robert was still dead, and my daughter grew up without a father, and I've been holding this land by myself ever since." She stood. "So when you tell me you're sorry, Mr. Croft, I believe that you mean it. I just want you to understand that your sorry and my sorry are two different things." Elias said nothing. There was nothing that could be said to that. Adelaide gathered her kit. "There's a blanket on the rail. June will bring you water before bed." She turned to go. "Mrs. Hartwell." She stopped, but didn't turn. "Your daughter found me at the worst moment I've had in a long time," Elias said slowly. "I'm not going to tell you what I was doing when she found me, because you've got enough weight to carry without adding mine to it. But I want you to know." He stopped, started again. "She's going to be something, that girl. She already is. You did that." A long silence. "I know," Adelaide said quietly. And then she walked out of the barn, and the door swung shut behind her, and Elias was alone in the lantern light with the old hound dog, and the sound of horses breathing, and the fever that hadn't broken yet. June appeared in the doorway a few minutes later with a tin cup of water and a biscuit wrapped in cloth. She handed them over without ceremony and sat down cross-legged in the hay across from him. "She doesn't hate you," she said. "I want you to know that. She hates what happened to Papa. She hates the uniform, but she doesn't hate you. She can't. She's trying to, and she can't do it." She picked at a loose thread on her dress. "That's how I know she'll help you get better. You sound very sure about a lot of things for a 10-year-old. "I pay attention." She looked at him squarely. "Do you want to get better, Mr. Croft? Not just from the leg. I mean the rest of it. Whatever was in your face when I found you." The question sat between them in the warm half-dark. Elias turned the tin cup in his hands. He thought about the 18 months since his discharge, about the towns he'd drifted through, the work he'd taken, and abandoned the mornings he'd woken up, and had to find a reason to stand up. About how the reasons had gotten thinner and thinner until there weren't any left, and he'd ridden out here to the backcountry with one bullet and a plan that a 10-year-old girl had interrupted before he could see it through. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but that might be the first honest answer I've given in a long time." June nodded like this was acceptable. "That's a start," she said. "That's how Mama got better after Papa died. She didn't know if she wanted to keep going. She just kept not stopping, and eventually not stopping became something closer to wanting." She stood and brushed hay from her dress. "Sleep, Mr. Croft. Mom'll check on you in the night whether she admits it or not." She slipped out through the door, and the barn settled into stillness around him. Elias lay back against the hay and stared up at the rafters and listened to the sound of the homestead at night. June's voice murmuring through the walls of the house. Adelaide's answering in a lower register, the creak of a rocking chair, the wind moving through the pine trees on the ridge. The sounds of a household that was battered and tired and still somehow alive, still going, still not stopping. He closed his eyes. The fever took him down slowly the way a river takes a stone, and somewhere in the dark before morning he dreamed of nothing. No battlefields, no faces, no weight of things done and left undone. Only quiet and warmth and the distant sound of a woman's voice he hadn't earned the right to yet. But he was going to be alive in the morning to try. That was something. That was more than he'd had yesterday. The fever broke somewhere around 3 in the morning. Elias knew it, the way you know when a storm has passed, not by any single thing, but by the sudden absence of pressure, the air-changing quality, the body unclenching from something it had been braced against for so long, it had forgotten what normal felt like. He lay on the hay bale in the dark and felt the sweat cooling on his skin and thought with a kind of dull surprise that he was still alive. He heard the barn door open a few minutes later. Soft steps. A lantern turned low. Adelaide Hartwell stood over him with a tin cup in one hand and her other hand pressed briefly to his forehead. A clinical touch, brief and impersonal, gone before he could react to it. She straightened. "Fever's down," she said as if reporting weather. "Yes, ma'am." "Drink this." She held out the cup. "It's willow bark tea. Tastes like creek mud, but it'll keep the fever from coming back." He drank it. She was right about the taste. "What time is it?" "Late enough that you should be sleeping, and early enough that I should be." She didn't move to leave. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, looking at him with that careful, assessing expression he was beginning to recognize as her default setting, the face of a woman who had learned to see threats before they materialized. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." "That means bad." "It means manageable, Mrs. Hartwell." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one maybe. "You're stubborn," she said. "I've been told that." "By who?" "My commanding officer, mostly. Before I stopped having one." He handed the empty cup back to her. "How long have you been coming out to check on me?" A pause. "I haven't." "The lantern's warm," Elias said. "It was lit before you came in. You've been out here before tonight." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. "You're observant. I was a scout for 6 years. It's a difficult habit to break." He shifted against the hay, trying to find a position that didn't pull on the stitched wound. "You don't have to pretend you don't care whether I live or die, Mrs. Hartwell. June already told me you'd come check on me whether you admitted it or not. June talks too much. June talks exactly enough." He looked up at her. "She's remarkable. You know that." Adelaide's jaw tightened. "I know." She set the cup down on the rail beside him and turned to go, and then stopped and turned back, and Elias got the sense this was not something she did often, reversing a decision midway through. "You said last night that you weren't going to tell me what you were doing when June found you," she said. "I'm not asking you to, but I want you to know that I'm not foolish enough to have missed it." Her eyes held his steadily. "I want you to know that if you're still in that place where you were, you need to tell me. Not because I'll be gentle about it. I won't. But because my daughter has already decided you matter, and I won't have her watch another person disappear." The words came at him quietly, but they had weight behind them. Real weight. "I'm not in that place," Elias said slowly. "I'm not sure I can promise I won't find my way back to it. But right now, tonight, no. I'm not there." Adelaide nodded once. "All right." She picked up the lantern. "Sleep, Mr. Croft. I'll send June with breakfast when the sun comes up." She left, and the dark settled back around him, and Elias stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that a woman with every reason to hate the sight of him had been coming out to check his fever in the middle of the night. He didn't let himself make too much of it. But he didn't make nothing of it either. He was asleep again before he could decide which was wiser. June arrived with breakfast the way she arrived at everything at speed, with enthusiasm, carrying more than she should have been able to manage. She had a plate of eggs and cornbread in one hand, and a tin of coffee in the other, and a book tucked under her arm, and she set all of it down on the hay beside Elias, and then sat cross-legged and looked at him with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking at something. "Your color's better," she said. "Good morning to you, too. Mama said you made it through the night, so I told her so, and she said that wasn't a proper thing to say. And I said she taught me always to state the truth, and she didn't have an answer for that." June picked up the book from beside her. "Can you read?" "I can read." "Good. I've been working through this one." She held it out, a battered copy of David Copperfield's Spine Cracked, and pages soft with handling. "There are words in it that Mama can't figure out either, and she's the smartest person I know, so if you can't figure them out, we'll just skip them and decide they're not important." Elias took the book, opened it to a random page. "Procrastination," he said. "That's one of the words. It means putting off what you should do now until later." June considered this. "Mama says that's a sin." "Your mama seems like a woman of strong convictions." "She is." June tilted her head. "What were your convictions?" "Mr. Croft, before everything went wrong." The question landed with the particular precision of something a child asks without knowing how precisely they've aimed it. Elias set down the book and picked up the cornbread and thought about how to answer her honestly without handing her more than she needed to carry. "I believed in doing right by people," he said finally. "I believed a man's word was the most important thing he had. I believed the work you put in determined the life you got out." He paused. Then I spent 6 years in circumstances that punished all three of those beliefs pretty thoroughly, and I came out the other side not knowing what I believed anymore. So you stopped believing in things? More like I ran out of things to believe in. June nodded slowly, turning this over with the seriousness she brought to most things. Mama went through something like that after Papa died, she said. She stopped planting the kitchen garden the second year. Just stopped. Let it go to weeds. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now. When you lose the main thing, sometimes you can't hold on to the smaller things either. She looked at him. But she started planting again. The third year she started planting again. What changed? Me. June said it simply without pride. Just fact. I asked her if we could grow sunflowers. I don't know why I asked. I just wanted to see something yellow. And she said yes, and then she was out there planting, and once she started, she just kept going. She shrugged. Sometimes you need a reason small enough to say yes to. Elias looked at the girl for a moment. How old did you say you were? 10. You're sure? Last April. She grinned at him, and for a moment she was simply a child, unguarded and bright. Why? Because you talk like someone who's been here considerably longer. The grin softened into something more complicated. Papa used to say the same thing, she said quietly. He said I came out of the womb already knowing things. She picked at the hem of her dress. I miss him. I don't remember his voice anymore, and that's the part that scares me. I remember his hands. I remember he smelled like pine resin and leather. But the voice is getting farther away. She looked up at Elias directly, without flinching from her own honesty. Does that happen? Do people just fade? Elias thought of his brother. Thomas, 17 years old, dead at Shiloh with a letter from their mother still unread in his coat pocket. He'd spent 3 years trying to remember the exact sound of Thomas's laugh, and failing, and he understood what June was describing with a precision that hurt. Some things fade, he said carefully. But the important parts stay. The way you felt around a person that doesn't go. The shape they left in your life, the habits you learned because of them. Those stay. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Papa taught me to play cards. Mama says it's a terrible thing to teach a child, but she plays cards with me every Sunday evening anyway. She smiled again, smaller this time. I think she does it because it was his thing. She keeps his thing going even when she pretends she's just humoring me. Your mama's more tender-hearted than she wants anyone to know. Yes. June stood and collected the empty plate. Don't tell her I told you that. She'd be furious. She left him with the book and the cooling coffee, and Elias sat with both of them and listened to the sounds of the homestead coming to life around him. Adelaide moving through the morning chores with the focused efficiency, he was already learning to recognize the particular rhythm of someone who has organized their grief into productivity and refuses to let it stop her. By the third day he was on his feet, not comfortably, not without the kind of pain that made his back teeth ache, but upright, which was more than he'd expected when Adelaide had set in on the wound with that whiskey and that merciless expertise. He limped from the barn to the fence line that separated the yard from the pasture and stood there in the cold morning air with his hand on the rail and breathed, just breathed, and let the mountains remind him that the world was considerably larger than his own ruination. He heard her before he saw her. The crunch of boots on frozen grass deliberate enough that she wanted him to know she was coming. You shouldn't be standing on that leg, Adelaide said, coming to stop a few feet away from him. Probably not. Then why are you? Because the barn was getting smaller by the hour. He looked out over the pasture. 3 of the fence posts on the far side were listing badly, one already fallen. That section's going to go before winter's properly set in, he said. Adelaide followed his gaze. I know. I've been meaning to get to it. I can fix it. You can barely stand. I can stand well enough to drive a fence post. He turned to look at her. I owe you my life, Mrs. Hartwell. I'd like to start doing something about that debt. Adelaide looked at him with that flat measuring expression. I didn't save you so you'd owe me, she said. I saved you because June asked me to, and because leaving you to die in my barn wasn't something I was willing to have on my conscience. That's the beginning and the end of it. All right, I won't call it a debt then. He looked back at the fence. But I'd like to fix your fence posts all the same. A long pause. There's a post hole digger in the barn, she said finally. And new posts cut and stacked on the south side. June will show you where. She turned to go, then stopped in that way she had of stopping like she'd been about to go, and then changed her mind about something. Don't overdo it, she said without turning around. If you reopen that wound, I'm not stitching it again. Yes, ma'am. She walked back to the house, and Elias watched her go, and felt something in the vicinity of his chest, doing something he hadn't given it permission to do. He fixed the fence posts. It took most of the morning and hurt considerably more than he'd let himself anticipate. But when he was done, the line stood straight and solid, and the particular satisfaction of that, the simple, clean satisfaction of a thing done right, hit him somewhere. He hadn't felt anything in a very long time. June sat on the top rail at the far end and watched him work, keeping up a steady conversation about nothing and everything, asking questions about the cavalry and the territories, and what snow looked like in Wyoming, and whether he'd ever met a real Apache warrior, and he answered as honestly as he could, while his arms remembered what useful work felt like. Adelaide came out at midday with water and biscuits and set them on the fence rail without comment. She looked at the repaired section for a moment. You do good work, she said. My father was a farmer, Elias said. Before everything else, I learned fence posts. She looked at him. Where's your father now? Dead. My mother too. Fever the winter I was 19. He picked up the water. I had a brother. He died at Shiloh. Something in Adelaide's face shifted. Not softening exactly, but something. A recognition maybe. The particular way one person identifies grief in another because they're carrying their own. I'm sorry, she said. Thank you. He drank. I know it doesn't change anything, but I mean it. She looked at him steadily for a moment. I know you do, she said, and her voice had lost some of its edge. Not all of it, but some. And for Adelaide Hartwell, he was beginning to understand some was a great deal. She left them to the afternoon, and June climbed down from the rail and fell into step beside Elias as he limped back toward the barn, and she said you do good work. I heard. She doesn't say that to people. June looked up at him. She didn't say it to either of the men she hired last summer. She told them what to do and paid them what she owed, and that was all. She paused. She said it to you. Don't read too much into it. I'm not reading anything into it, June said in a voice that suggested she was reading quite a lot into it. I'm just stating facts. You said your father taught you that a man's word was the most important thing he had. She glanced at him sideways. Mama says actions are more important than words. Says words are easy and actions are what prove things. She stepped around a rut in the yard. You've been here 4 days and you fixed her fence. That's an action. It's fence posts, June. Everything starts somewhere, she said with the absolute confidence of a person who has not yet been disappointed enough times to lose faith in starting points. And she went to collect the eggs, and Elias stood in the yard with his bad leg and his mending wound and the thin October sunlight on his face, and let himself just barely consider the possibility that she might be right. That evening, Adelaide made venison stew that smelled like something Elias had given up expecting from the world. The three of them ate at the table together first, and the conversation was careful and brief, June carrying most of it, but the silence between her contributions was no longer entirely hostile. It had become something else, something that had room in it. After June had gone to bed, Adelaide poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Elias without asking whether he wanted it. She sat across the table from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment before she looked up. My husband filed this land claim 8 months before he died, she said. He said this valley was going to be worth something someday. Said the railroad would come through and the whole territory would open up, and if we were here first with clean title, we'd be set for life. She paused. He was right about the land. He just wasn't here to see it. She looked at Elias directly. There are men who know that. Men who've been making offers since the first year. I've turned them down every time. They'll come back. They always do. Her jaw set. And I'll keep turning them down. This land is mine. It was Robert's, and now it's mine, and someday it'll be June's, and I won't be pressured or maneuvered or sweet-talked out of a single acre of it. I believe you, Elias said. She studied him. You're not going to tell me it's too much for a woman alone to hold on to. Not going to suggest I'd be better off taking the money and finding somewhere easier. No, ma'am. Most men do. I'm not most men, Mrs. Hartwell. A beat of silence. No, Adelaide said slowly, like she was admitting something she hadn't fully decided to admit. I'm beginning to think you're not. She stood, collected the cups, moved to the basin. With her back to him, she said, You can sleep in the house tonight. There's a spare room. It's small, but it's warmer than the barn. She didn't turn around. June would want that. She worries about you out there. Only June. The question slipped out before he could stop it. He saw her shoulders still for just a fraction of a second. Then she set the cups down in the basin. Good night, Mr. Croft, she said, and her voice was carefully neutral, and there was something underneath it that was not neutral at all. Good night, Mrs. Hartwell. He moved into the spare room that night and lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle around him, and heard June talking softly in her sleep, and heard Adelaide moving through her final quiet routines before the lamp went out. The sounds of a household. The sounds of people who were still here, still fighting, still refusing to stop. He thought about what June had said, about Adelaide planting sunflowers again, about small enough reasons to say yes. He thought about the fence posts standing straight in the cold morning light, and the way Adelaide had looked at them for that one unguarded moment, before she remembered to be careful. He thought about how the valley looked at sunset from the ridge, the mountains going gold, and the shadows going long, and the whole world feeling for just a breath like something worth staying in. And Elias Croft, who had ridden out here with one bullet and nothing left to lose, closed his eyes and slept through the night without dreaming of dying. He dreamed instead of sunflowers. 3 weeks passed, the way hard work passes fast during the doing of it, and somehow longer when you looked back and counted what had been accomplished. Elias's leg healed the way Adelaide had promised it would, leaving a scar and a slight pull when the weather turned cold, and nothing else worth mentioning. He worked. He worked the way a man works when he's trying to prove something to himself, and isn't quite ready to admit what it is. Sunup to sundown without complaint, taking on whatever the homestead demanded, and then looking for more. He reshored the barn's east wall. He rebuilt the chicken coop roof properly with real bracing instead of the patchwork Adelaide had managed alone. He hauled river stones to reinforce the kitchen garden borders before the ground froze solid. He split enough firewood to stack a cord and a half against the north wall of the house, and when Adelaide came out and looked at it with her arms crossed, and that measuring expression, he simply went back and split more. June followed him through most of it, talking, asking, learning. She had a mind that didn't stop, that turned everything over and examined it from all sides before filing it away, and Elias found himself teaching her things he hadn't thought about in years. How to read weather in the shape of clouds, how to tell which would split clean and which would fight you, how to set a nail so it held instead of working loose over time. She absorbed it all with that quiet, serious attention, and then asked 3 more questions he hadn't anticipated. Adelaide watched. She didn't comment. But she watched, and Elias knew she was watching, and neither of them said anything about it. The trouble announced itself on a gray Tuesday morning in the form of a man on a sorrel horse who rode up the trail at a pace that said he'd made this ride before and expected to be received well. He was well dressed in the particular way of men who want you to know they represent money coat too fine for ranch country boots without a scuff on them. He tipped his hat at Adelaide where she stood on the porch and smiled the smile of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. Mrs. Hartwell, my name is Douglas Prentice. I represent the Western Consolidated Land Company out of Denver. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. I believe my associate Mr. Calder has been in contact with you previously regarding your property. He has, Adelaide said. She didn't move to take the envelope. And I gave him the same answer I'm going to give you. This land isn't for sale. Prentice's smile didn't waver. I understand your attachment, ma'am, and I respect it deeply. However, I've been authorized to present an offer considerably more generous than anything you've previously received. He extended the envelope again. The railroad survey has been confirmed. This valley sits on the primary route. The land you're standing on will be worth 4 times what we're offering within 18 months. We're giving you the opportunity to take a certain sum now, rather than risk. Risk what? Adelaide said. Her voice was very quiet. Finish that sentence, Mr. Prentice. The smile held, but something behind it shifted. The frontier is unpredictable, Mrs. Hartwell. A woman in your position? What position is that? Elias came around the corner of the barn, then not hurrying, just appearing the way he'd learned to appear during his scouting years, present and purposeful and impossible to miss. He stopped at the edge of the yard with his thumbs in his belt and looked at Prentice with the flat, patient attention of a man who has all the time in the world and knows it. Prentice looked at him, recalculated. I wasn't aware Mrs. Hartwell had taken on a hand. Mr. Croft manages the property, Adelaide said, and the steadiness in her voice when she said it hit Elias somewhere between his ribs. She hadn't hesitated. What position were you referring to, Mr. Prentice? You were about to finish your thought. Prentice folded the envelope and returned it to his coat with the deliberate care of a man deciding to change his approach. I simply meant that managing a property of this size without adequate resources is a significant undertaking. Our offer would allow you to relocate somewhere with more support, better schooling for your daughter, more opportunities. June has opportunities, Adelaide said. She has this land and everything we've built on it. That's more opportunity than most. She came down one step from the porch. I'm going to be very clear with you, Mr. Prentice, because I've found that clear is kinder than polite in the long run. This land belonged to my husband. He's buried 200 yards east of where you're sitting. My daughter was born here. I have filed legal claim, paid my taxes, and worked every inch of this property with my own hands. No number you put in that envelope will change any of those facts. She looked at him without blinking. Now I've got work to do. I'd be grateful if you'd go do yours somewhere else. Prentice held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Elias again, and Elias looked back and nothing was said, but the conversation was very clear. Prentice picked up his reins. I'll leave the offer with the land agent in town, he said, in case you change your mind. He tipped his hat again, and the smile had gone from his face entirely. Good day, Mrs. Hartwell. He rode out. The yard was quiet for a moment after his horse disappeared down the trail. June came out of the house and stood on the porch and looked at her mother. Was that the landman again? Another one, Adelaide said. What did you tell him? The same thing I always tell them. June nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Adelaide stood in the yard with her eyes on the empty trail for a moment longer, and then she turned and looked at Elias, and he saw something in her face that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling you get when you hear distant thunder and start counting the seconds. That won't be the end of it, she said. No, Elias agreed. Men like that don't write off an investment easy. What do you think they'll do? He thought about it honestly. Pressure first, make things difficult. Small things that can't be proven. Water troubles, fence, problems, livestock gone missing. Make it hard enough that you start thinking the money sounds better than the fight. He met her eyes. They'll underestimate you, which is the mistake men like that always make. But when they figure out that's not working, they might try something harder. Adelaide absorbed this without visible reaction. I won't leave. I know. I mean it. I don't care what they do. I won't leave. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. And I won't leave either. She looked at him, then really looked at him in that way she'd been careful not to do too directly in the weeks since he'd come inside from the barn. He could see her deciding something, weighing something. I haven't asked you to stay, she said carefully. No, ma'am. I'm telling you as a fact, not asking your permission. He kept his voice easy. This is your land and your decision in all things. But you asked me 3 weeks ago to manage this property, And that's what I intend to do. If men come to make trouble, trouble is something I have some experience with." A long pause. The wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge. Somewhere in the barn, the mare shifted in her stall. "All right," Adelaide said, and turned back toward the house. Prentice's next move came 5 days later, and announced itself as nothing, which was exactly the point. Elias found the south pasture fence cut in the night clean cuts that didn't happen by accident, and 3 of the horses gone. He and Adelaide tracked them to a draw a mile east and brought them back without incident, but the message was clear. Someone had been on their property in the dark and done it quietly enough that neither the dog nor Elias had heard them. He didn't sleep the following night. He sat in the barn loft with the rifle Adelaide had given him access to, without comment and without ceremony, simply setting it against the wall of his room one evening with a box of shells beside it, and he watched the approaches to the property and let the night pass around him and thought about what was coming. Adelaide found him up there at dawn when she came to feed the horses. She looked up at him and looked at the rifle and didn't say anything for a moment. "You were up all night," she said. "Somebody ought to be." "That somebody doesn't have to be you. It does right now." He climbed down from the loft. "Someone who knows what they're doing cut those fence lines, Ada." He used her name for the first time without thinking about it, and then the awareness of it landed between them, and he pressed on before either of them could address it. "They'll come back. Could be tonight. Could be a week from now. But they'll come back, and I want to be ready." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. He couldn't tell if she'd noticed the name. He suspected she had, and that she'd filed it away somewhere she intended to examine later. "What do you need?" she asked. "Another pair of eyes if you're willing. We set watches. I take the first half of the night, you take the second." "And June?" "June stays in the house with the door latched. She's got good instincts, and she's not a fool. She'll know what to do if something goes wrong inside." Adelaide nodded slowly. "All right." She moved to the feed bin and started measuring out the morning grain. "Elias?" She said it without looking up. He heard the deliberateness of it, the choice she'd made somewhere between his use of her name and this moment. "What you said about not leaving. I need to know you mean it, not as a courtesy. Not because you feel obligated after the leg." She looked up at him then, and the directness in it was something he'd stopped finding startling and started finding like solid ground. "I need to know you mean it, because what's coming is going to be hard, and I can't organize my plans around someone who might decide the trouble isn't worth it." "I mean it," Elias said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Why?" She asked it plainly the way she asked everything. "Give me the real reason." He thought about the easy answers and let them go. "Because I haven't had anything worth staying for in a long time," he said. "And this." He looked around at the barn, at the homestead beyond it, at the mountains behind that. "This is worth staying for. You and June are worth staying for. And I think you know that, and I think that's what's scaring you." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things neither of them was ready to say out loud, yet things that needed more time, and more proof, and more ordinary mornings like this one before they could survive being spoken. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to the grain, and her voice was very steady. "The west approach is harder to watch from the barn loft," she said. "There's a better vantage from the top of the wood pile if you move the top 2 rows. I'll do that tonight." "Good." They worked the rest of the morning side by side without talking much, and the quiet between them was a different kind of quiet than it had been 3 weeks ago. It had room in it now. The men came on a Thursday. Elias heard them before he saw them. The sound of horses being walked slowly, trying for quiet, and not quite achieving it 2 hours past midnight when the moon was down and the dark was at its thickest. He didn't move fast. He moved right, which was a different thing. He got down from the woodpile without sound, and went to the back of the house and knocked twice soft on Adelaide's window, and she was up and at the door with her rifle in 40 seconds, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. "2, maybe 3 horses," he said quietly, "coming from the northwest, heading for the cattle pen." She checked her rifle without a word and positioned herself at the corner of the house. Elias circled wide through the dark toward the cattle pen, using the shadows and the layout of the property, the way he'd spent weeks learning to use them. He'd walked this ground at night deliberately quietly alone for exactly this reason. He heard them before the pen, two men moving with more confidence now that they thought the dark had them covered. He caught a fragment of low voice and then the sound of wire cutters working on the pen gate. "That's far enough," Elias said. They froze. He had them against the open dark with the cattle pen fence at their backs. No cover, no advantage. "I can see you both clearly," he said, which was mostly true. "And the woman behind me has a rifle on the larger of you, and she's a better shot than I am, which is saying something." He kept his voice level conversational. "You're going to put down whatever's in your hands, and you're going to tell me who sent you." One of them younger, Elias could tell by the voice, said. "We don't know what you're—" "Don't," Elias said. "I've been a scout and a soldier for 6 years. I've had men lie to me in 3 languages. Don't." He took 2 steps closer. "Prentice sent you. The question is whether you're smart enough to understand that what he's paying you isn't worth what's about to happen to you if you don't start talking." The older one cracked first. They always did. "We were just supposed to run off some cattle," he said. "Nobody said anything about the woman with the rifle." "No, they wouldn't." Elias stopped 10 feet from them. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on your horses, and you're going to ride back to Prentice, and you're going to tell him that the Hartwell property is defended, and that the next men he sends are going to meet a different kind of welcome. You understand me?" A pause. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to prove anything tonight. Tonight I need you off this property." His voice dropped into something quieter and considerably colder. "And I need you to understand I spent 6 years in territory where men disappeared and nobody asked questions. I'm a different man than I was then. But I haven't forgotten everything I learned." He let that settle. "Get off this land." They went, horses moving fast, no longer trying for quiet. Elias stood and listened until the sound of them dissolved into the night, and there was nothing left but the cattle shifting uneasily in the pen and the wind and the creak of the property settling. Adelaide appeared beside him. She'd come around the other side without a sound. She stood looking in the direction the riders had gone, her rifle still in her hands, her jaw set with a fury that was too controlled to be anything but deeply felt. "Prentice," she said. "Had to be. He's going to keep sending men. Until he decides the cost is too high." Elias turned to look at her. In the dark, her face was very still. "You all right?" "I'm angry," she said, precise and honest as always. "I'm angry that I have to defend my own land from men who think a woman holding a deed is an inconvenience to be managed." She exhaled. "I'm angry that June has to grow up knowing this is the world." A pause. "And I'm grateful." She said the last word like it cost her something. "I'm grateful you were here tonight. I want you to know that. You'd have handled it, maybe, but I didn't have to." She finally looked at him directly, and the moonlight had come back at the edges while they'd been talking just enough to catch the expression on her face, and it was not the expression of a woman who was grateful in a simple, uncomplicated way. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. We should talk about what comes next." They went inside, and June appeared in the doorway of her room 10 seconds after they'd closed the door. Fully dressed, boots on, with the particular expression of a child who has been awake listening and is pretending she hasn't. "I heard horses," she said. "Everything's all right," Adelaide said. "I know." June looked at Elias. "Did you run them off?" "We did." "Good." She looked between them at her mother's rigid back, and at Elias's face, and at the space between them that had been changing for weeks in ways she'd been watching with great attention. She seemed to make some internal assessment and arrive at a conclusion she found satisfying. "I'm going back to bed," she announced and disappeared. Adelaide set the kettle on the stove. Her back was to Elias, and she was quiet for long enough that he thought maybe she'd decided the conversation she'd mentioned could wait until morning. Then she said without turning around, Robert used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone is that it makes you afraid in a way you can't control. He said fear was the price of caring about something enough to lose it. She set the cups on the table. I've been afraid since the day he died. Not of the land speculators. Not of hard winters or bad luck or any of the things that can actually hurt you out here. She turned around. I've been afraid of caring about something enough to lose it again. Elias looked at her across the table. I know, he said quietly. I'm not ready, she said. I want to say that clearly. I'm not ready for whatever this is that's changing between us. I don't know if I'll be ready for a long time. All right, but I'm not asking you to leave. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her empty cup the way she did when she was thinking hard. I'm asking you to be patient, and I'm asking you not to make me say things I'm not ready to say. I won't, Elias said. I'll wait as long as it takes Adelaide. I've got nowhere else I need to be. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, not opened exactly, but stopped being quite so carefully shut. You're a strange man, Elias Croft, she said. You came here to die, and instead you're sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m. talking about patience. June has a theory about that. June has a theory about everything. She says sometimes you need a reason small enough to say yes to. He looked at her steadily. This was mine. This kitchen. This property. That girl in there and her mother who saved my life when they had every reason not to. The kettle began to whistle. Adelaide got up to take it off the heat, and he heard her breath catch very slightly just once before she controlled it. When she set the kettle down, she stood with her back to him for a moment, and her shoulders were very still, and then she poured the coffee and brought the cups to the table and sat back down. Tell me about your brother, she said. Thomas, tell me what he was like. And Elias told her. For the first time since Shiloh, he told someone what Thomas had been like, the laugh that got him in trouble, the way he'd learned to ride before he'd learned to read the letter, still unread in his coat pocket, the specific quality of the silence that had been left in the world when he was gone from it. He talked until the coffee was cold, and Adelaide listened the way she did everything with her whole self. Nothing held back, giving the thing in front of her exactly what it was worth. And when he finished, she said, He sounds like someone worth grieving properly, worth naming something after someday. Yes, Elias said. He was. Outside, the night held the homestead in its dark hands, and the cattle had settled, and the threat that had ridden away into the darkness would come back in some other form, and there were hard days still ahead, and harder decisions to make, and neither of them was foolish enough to believe otherwise. But inside the kitchen, with the cold coffee between them, and the lamp burning low, and June asleep in the next room, something that had been broken for a very long time in both of them was very quietly beginning to mend. Prentice came back himself 10 days later, and this time he didn't bother with the smile. He rode up in the late afternoon with 2 men behind him who wore their guns low and their expressions flat, and he stopped in the yard and looked at the homestead the way a man looks at something he's decided to take by other means, since asking hasn't worked. Adelaide was on the porch when he arrived. Elias came out of the barn. June, who had been helping him rehang the barn door, stayed exactly where she was in the doorway, watching with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Hartwell, Prentice said. No hat tip this time. I think it's time we had a more direct conversation. I've found all our conversations fairly direct, Adelaide said. The men you sent away last week were trespassing, Elias said. He stopped at the edge of the yard far enough to watch both men behind Prentice without turning his head. I could have reported it to the county sheriff. I chose not to as a courtesy. I won't make that choice twice. Prentice looked at him with the particular contempt of a man who has decided that someone standing between him and what he wants is simply an obstacle to be factored. You have no legal standing on this property, Mr. Croft. You're a hired hand. Whatever Mrs. Hartwell has told you about your role here, he has every legal standing, Adelaide said. I've filed an amendment to the land deed with the county recorder, adding Mr. Croft as co-manager of this property. That was done 3 days ago. I have the paperwork inside if you'd like to see it. Elias looked at her. She had not told him this. She looked steadily at Prentice and did not look at Elias. But the faintest color had come into her cheeks, and he understood she'd done it deliberately and had been waiting for the right moment to say it. Prentice absorbed this with the stillness of a man who is recalculating and doesn't want to show it. That's an interesting development, he said. It won't change the fundamental situation, however. The railroad has finalized its route. This valley is in the path of significant development, and the Western Consolidated Land Company is prepared to move forward with or without your cooperation. I strongly advise you to reconsider our offer before that process becomes... He paused, complicated. Are you threatening me? Adelaide said. I'm advising you. You're threatening me. She came down the 2 porch steps and into the yard, and her voice dropped into something very quiet and very certain. You came to my home with armed men to threaten a woman and a child over a piece of land your company wants to profit from. I want you to hear yourself doing that, Mr. Prentice. I want you to understand what kind of man that makes you. Prentice's jaw tightened. The offer expires at the end of the month. It expired the first time you sent men in the dark to cut my fence lines. Adelaide looked at him without any expression that could be used against her. Get off my land! The 2 men behind Prentice shifted slightly. Elias watched their hands without appearing to. He'd been watching hands long before he'd learned to watch faces, and what he saw now was men who were hired and not particularly committed and were doing the same arithmetic. He was the arithmetic of whether this was worth what it was going to cost. This isn't finished, Prentice said. It is for today. Elias held his gaze. And every day after today that you come on this property without an invitation, we'll be filing a report with the sheriff's office, written, dated, signed. You build up enough of those and your company's Denver board starts asking questions about why your Colorado acquisition is attracting legal attention. He kept his voice conversational. Men like you answer to men above you, Prentice. I'd think about that. Something flickered behind Prentice's eyes. Not retreat exactly, but reconsideration. He gathered his reins, and the 2 men behind him were already turning their horses before he'd made up his mind, which told Elias everything he needed to know about their investment in this situation. End of the month, Prentice said again and rode out. The yard was quiet for a moment. June came out of the barn doorway and walked to her mother's side and took her hand without saying anything, and Adelaide closed her fingers around her daughter's and stood looking at the empty trail until the sound of hooves disappeared entirely. Then she said, We need to go to town. Today, June asked. Tomorrow morning. First light. She turned and looked at Elias. I want to speak to Walt Greer. He was Robert's closest friend out here, and he knows everyone in the county worth knowing. If Prentice is making moves with the railroad company, Walt will know about it, and he'll know who else might be affected. She paused. And I want to see the sheriff myself. File a report in person the way you described. That's the right move, Elias said. She held his gaze for a moment. You're coming. Yes, ma'am. She nodded once and went inside, and June lingered in the yard for a moment, still looking at the trail. He's not going to stop, she said quietly. She wasn't asking. No, Elias said, but stopping isn't the only way to win. June looked at him sidelong. What's the other way? Make it cost more than it's worth. He looked down at her. Your mama understands that. That's why she's been turning down his money from the start. Not because she couldn't use it, because accepting it would have told him the right pressure in the right place could move her. She never gave him that. He paused. She never gave anybody that. June was quiet for a moment, thinking it over with that particular thoroughness of hers. She gave you something, she said. She put your name on the deed. I know. She didn't tell you she was going to do it. I know that too. June looked at him with an expression that was purely transparently delighted and trying very hard not to show it. She likes you, she said in the tone of someone reporting a scientific finding. She doesn't know what to do about it, and it's making her do things like put your name on legal documents without telling you which is probably the most mama way of liking someone that has ever existed. She turned and walked toward the house. "I think it's very funny," she said over her shoulder. "In a nice way." "June." She stopped. "Don't tell your mother you think it's funny." "Obviously," she said, and went inside. Walt Greer turned out to be a barrel-chested man of 60, with a white beard and eyes the color of old denim, and he met them in front of the general store in town the next morning, with the careful warmth of a man who has been waiting for Adelaide Hartwell to ask for help for 4 years, and has been wise enough not to offer it before she was ready. He shook Adelaide's hand, and then Elias's, and his grip said, he'd spent his life doing physical work and hadn't stopped yet. "Prentice," he said when Adelaide had laid out the situation in her precise, economical way. "I know him. Know his company better." He leaned against the hitching post and crossed his arms. "They've been buying up claims all along the proposed route. Some of them willing sales, some of them not. Couple of families south of here sold under pressure. They didn't have words for nothing. They could prove just enough trouble that staying stopped being worth it." His eyes moved to Elias. "You a former cavalryman?" "Yes, sir, Elias Croft." "You scout for Mackenzie's outfit?" 2 years, before that Reynolds." Walt nodded slowly, something settling in his expression. "I knew a Croft, Thomas Croft, Shiloh." The name hit Elias in the chest the way it always did. "My brother." Walt was quiet for a moment. "He was a good soldier," he said with the simplicity of someone who has known enough of them to mean the distinction. "I'm sorry for your loss." He shifted his attention back to Adelaide. "Now, what do you need?" "I need to know if there are other landowners in the valley who'd stand together against the company's tactics. And I need to know if the sheriff's office is worth talking to, or whether Prentice has already made arrangements there." Walt considered both questions with equal seriousness. "Henderson at the land recorder's office is clean. He's got no love for the railroad speculators. They've been making his job miserable for 2 years. The sheriff," he tilted his head, "Harlan Briggs is an honest man, but a cautious one. He won't move without documentation." He looked at Elias. "Your idea about the written reports is right. Build a paper record. Make it impossible to ignore." He pushed off the hitching post. "As for neighbors, there's 4 families still holding claims in the valley. The Sutter family north of you, the Calloways, east an old widow named Fletcher, who's been there since before the war, and Jim Beaumont, who runs cattle on the south end. Prentice has been at all of them." He looked at Adelaide directly. "If you're willing to be the one to ask, I think they'd stand with you. They're waiting to see if anyone else is going to hold." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. Elias watched her, thinking the particular quality of her attention when she was making a decision that mattered, the stillness that wasn't hesitation, but calculation. "Set up a meeting," she said. "All of them, at our place if they're willing. I'll feed them, and I'll lay out what I know, and we'll see where everyone stands." Walt smiled slowly, like a man who has been hoping for exactly this. "Ada Hartwell," he said, "you are more like Robert than you know. And I mean that as the highest compliment I have to offer." He looked at June. "And you, young lady, are even more alarming than the last time I saw you." "I know," June said pleasantly. "I've been reading." The meeting happened 5 days later. All 4 families came, which Elias took as a measure of how afraid people were, and how much they'd needed someone to call the gathering. They were cautious at first, the particular caution of people who have been managing alone for a long time and aren't sure yet whether cooperation is strength or exposure. But Adelaide laid out everything she knew without drama, without embellishment, in the flat, honest way that she did everything, and by the end of it, the room had changed. Jim Beaumont, a weathered man of 50, who'd been ranching the South End for 12 years, was the first to speak up. "They cut my north fence line twice this summer," he said. "Lost 6 head of cattle over it. I couldn't prove a thing." Margaret Fletcher, the widow, said, "A man came to my door in August and told me my land was in a floodplain and would be worthless once the railroad came. Said it as a fact. I found out afterward it wasn't true." Her voice was calm and deeply angry. "He lied to my face and thought I wouldn't know enough to check." The Sutter family, husband and wife, both weathered, both quiet, exchanged a look. "We almost sold," the wife said. 6 weeks ago. The offer was enough to relocate somewhere easier, and we were tired. She looked at Adelaide. What stopped us was hearing you'd turned them down 3 times. We figured if you were holding, we could hold a little longer. Adelaide listened to all of it without interrupting. When the room finished, she said, "None of us can fight this alone. That's what they're counting on, that we stay separate and scared. But there are 6 land claims in this valley, and if all 6 of us are filing documented reports with the sheriff's office, and if we're sharing information about what's being done to each of us, and if we're willing to stand up in front of a judge and say so," she paused, "then we're not a lone woman with a complaint. We're a pattern, and patterns are what courts understand." The room was quiet. Then Walt Greer, who'd come along and said almost nothing all evening, said, "She's right. And I'll tell you something else. The railroad company in Denver doesn't know that Prentice is running his operation this way. They want right-of-way, yes, but harassment and intimidation are liabilities they don't want attached to their name. If the right letter reaches the right desk," he looked at Adelaide, "the company might pull Prentice back themselves." "Can you write that letter?" Adelaide asked. "I know a man in Denver who'll make sure it's read," Walt said. "Give me a week." They shook hands, all of them, before they left. The Callaways, last a younger couple, nervous, the wife heavily pregnant, and the wife held Adelaide's hand for a moment longer than a handshake required, and said, "Thank you for calling us together. I've been so frightened." And Adelaide, who was not a woman who showed softness, easily said, "So have I. That's why I needed to stop being frightened alone." After everyone had gone, and June was asleep and the lamps were burning low, Elias and Adelaide sat at the kitchen table in the quiet that had become their habit and their language, and Adelaide said without preamble, "You should know why I put your name on the deed." Elias waited. "It wasn't only a legal strategy," she said. "I want to be honest about that. It was partly that having a man's name on the paperwork makes certain conversations with men like Prentice simpler, and I'm not too proud to use that." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "But it was also because—" She stopped. Started again. "Robert's name was on that deed. For 4 years, his name has been on it, and every time I filed anything with the county office, I saw his name, and it was like—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "It was like he was still here in some way, still part of it." She looked up at Elias. "I added your name. And I sat in that office and watched them write it in, and I didn't feel like I was erasing him. I felt like I was—" She searched for the word. Continuing. Like the land was still being cared for by someone who would fight for it the way he would have. Her voice was very steady, but costing her something to stay that way. "That's what I wanted you to know." Elias didn't say anything for a moment. The lamp flame shifted slightly in a draft from the window. Outside, somewhere past the ridge, a coyote sounded once and went quiet. "He would have liked you," Elias said finally, "from what you've told me about him. The kind of man who believed in building things and doing right by people. I think he would have looked at what you've made of this place without him and been grateful someone was here helping you hold it." Adelaide's eyes went bright for just a moment. She blinked once, controlled it. "You didn't know him." "No, but I know you. And what you've chosen to love says something about the man who taught you how." She looked at him across the table for a long moment. The careful distance she'd maintained for weeks had been closing so gradually that it was hard to say exactly when it had stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like the ordinary space between 2 people who share a life. It had happened the way seasons happen, not in a moment, but in an accumulation of moments, each one small enough to be manageable. "Elias," she said quietly, "what do you want? Not from this situation, not from the land or the legal business. What do you want?" The question deserved honesty, and he gave it. "I want this," he said. "This table, this house, this valley. June's voice in the morning and your coffee that's always too strong, and the satisfaction of work that means something at the end of the day." He held her gaze. "I want to be here long enough that it stops feeling like something I borrowed and starts feeling like something I belong to." He paused. "I want to deserve the name on that deed." Adelaide set down her cup. She reached across the table slowly, with the deliberateness of a woman who makes every choice with full awareness, and placed her hand over his. Her palm was calloused and warm and certain. "You already do," she said. "You have for a while. I've just been taking my time about saying it." His hand turned under hers and held it. Neither of them spoke. The lamp burned. The house settled around them with the particular sounds of a structure that has survived things and is still standing. And outside, the Colorado night held the valley in its cold hands, and 6 families who had been frightened and alone were perhaps sleeping a little easier than they had the night before. After a while, Adelaide said, "The Calloway woman is going to have that baby before winter sets in. I should go by with some things next week." "I'll drive you," Elias said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, but was the territory directly adjacent to one. "June's going to be insufferable about this," she said. "She already is. She told you something. She told me you liking someone in a way you don't know what to do about is apparently very funny, in a nice way." Adelaide made a sound that was absolutely unmistakably a laugh, short and surprised, and immediately suppressed her free hand coming up to cover her mouth, her eyes going bright with it. It was the most purely unguarded thing he'd seen from her, and it rearranged something in his chest permanently. "That child," she said when she'd recovered, "is entirely too observant. She comes by it honestly." Adelaide looked at him still with that brightness in her eyes, and for one moment the grief and the caution and the 4 years of holding everything together alone by sheer force of will were simply not on her face. There was just Adelaide, warm and real and present, and looking at him like he was something the world had sent her that she hadn't known to ask for. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for all of it. Thank you for letting me." She squeezed his hand once, and then released it and stood collecting the cups with her usual efficiency. The unsentimental practicality that was as much a part of her as the warmth underneath it. "Get some sleep," she said. "Walt's coming by in the morning to talk through the letter to Denver, and I want to have everything documented before he gets here." "Yes, ma'am." She stopped in the doorway to her room. "Elias." She said his name the way she'd been saying it for weeks now, like a word she'd decided to keep. "The offer expires at the end of the month, according to Prentice." "Yes." "I'm not worried about it." "Neither am I." She looked at him steadily. "Good night." "Good night, Adelaide." She went to her room, and the lamp in the main room burned on for a little while, and Elias sat in the quiet of the house and listened to the sounds of the place he had somehow improbably come to belong to, and felt something he barely recognized because he'd been without it for so long. He felt settled. Not happy in the uncomplicated way of people who haven't lost anything, but settled the particular piece of a man who has found ground worth standing on, and people worth standing with and knows it, and is not going to make the mistake of walking away from it again. In the next room, June said something in her sleep. A word indistinct but emphatic the way she said everything. He heard Adelaide's footsteps cross the floor to check on her, and the soft sound of a door, and then quiet again. He sat there for a little while longer, just listening to the house breathe around him, before he put out the lamp and went to bed. Prentice's letter arrived from Denver 2 weeks later. Walt Greer brought it himself riding up the trail in the early afternoon, with his beard and his old denim eyes, and a smile that said the news was good before he opened his mouth. The Western Consolidated Land Company had, following an inquiry from a senior partner in their Denver office, suspended all acquisition activities in the valley pending a review of their agent's methods. Prentice had been recalled. A new representative would be in contact with landowners by formal correspondence only. Walt read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, with June sitting beside him, following along, and Adelaide standing with her arms crossed and her eyes very still. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Is it over?" June asked. "The worst of it," Walt said. "They'll still want the land. But they'll come at it differently now formal offers legal channels, which you can handle." He looked at Adelaide, "Which you've been handling all along." Adelaide uncrossed her arms. She looked at Elias, and he looked at her. And the thing that moved between them in that look was something that had been building since a gray October morning when she'd checked his fever in the dark and pretended she hadn't. "June," she said, still looking at Elias. Go get the good coffee from the high shelf, the kind we save. June stood up immediately. Are we celebrating? We're celebrating, Adelaide said, and for the first time since Elias had known her, she said it without any reservation in it at all. The good coffee tasted like something worth keeping, and Walt Greer stayed through the afternoon, and by the time he rode home, the sun was low, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the particular warmth of people who have won something together and know it. June fell asleep in her chair before supper, worn out from the excitement of it, and Elias carried her to her room without waking her while Adelaide watched from the doorway with an expression he'd stopped trying to name because it was too many things at once. They ate supper quietly, just the two of them, and the quiet was the comfortable kind that had become their natural language. Adelaide made biscuits from the last of the good flour, and didn't comment on the occasion, which was its own kind of comment. When the dishes were done, she poured 2 cups of the ordinary coffee. The good kind was back on the high shelf, and sat across from him and said, I want to talk about spring. All right, the railroad's coming whether Prentice's company gets what they want or not. That means people coming through this valley. Families, workers, merchants. Everything changes when that happens, and we need to be ready before it does not after. She wrapped her hands around her cup in that way she had. I've been thinking about what we need to build this into a real working ranch, not just surviving, thriving. Tell me what you're thinking. Cattle primarily. Jim Beaumont's been ranching the South End for 12 years, and he's offered twice to sell me breeding stock at fair price if I ever decided to expand. The land can support a larger herd than we're running. She looked at him steadily. But cattle means more infrastructure. Better fencing a proper bunkhouse, someone besides the two of us managing the day-to-day. She paused. And it means taking a loan against the property, which means real risk. How much risk? Enough that if we fail, we lose everything. She said it plainly, the way she said all difficult things, looking straight at it instead of around it. I've done the numbers 3 times. The margins are thin the first 2 years, better the third, and by the time the railroad's operational, we'd be positioned to hold a supply contract for beef that would make those first 2 years worth it. She set down her cup. But I won't do it alone. I need to know if you're in this with me. Not as a hand, not as a co-manager on a legal document. She held his gaze. As a partner. In every meaning of the word. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up, the kind of wind that carried the first real bite of the coming winter in it, and the house answered with its familiar creaks and settlings. Elias looked at Adelaide across the table. This woman who had been managing everything alone for 4 years, and was now with all the deliberateness she brought to every decision choosing not to. Yes, he said. She nodded once. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and set something on the table between them. A ring, plain gold, worn smooth, a woman's ring. This was my mother's, she said. Not Robert's. Mine from before. I've been carrying it for 4 years, thinking I didn't know what to do with it. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. I know what to do with it now. Elias looked at the ring. Then he looked at her. Adelaide, don't make a speech, she said. I'm not good with speeches, and neither are you. Just tell me yes or no. Yes, he said for the second time, and it meant everything the first yes had meant, and considerably more. She pushed the ring across the table to him. I'd like you to put that on my finger, she said in the tone of someone making a reasonable and practical request. And then I'd like to discuss the cattle acquisition with Beaumont before the ground freezes because timing matters. He picked up the ring, reached across and took her left hand and slid it onto her finger, and her hand was warm and calloused, and didn't tremble because Adelaide Hartwell didn't tremble. But her fingers closed around his and held on with a grip that said everything her voice hadn't. Now, she said, and her voice was only very slightly not steady, about the Beaumont stock, Adelaide. Yes. Give me 1 minute before we talk about cattle. She looked at him. The lamp caught the copper in her hair and the brightness in her eyes and the smile she was working very hard not to show. 1 minute, she agreed. He came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and when he put his arms around her, she leaned into it with the whole weight of 4 years of holding herself upright alone, and he held her the way you hold something you came very close to never having, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying, that the silence wasn't already handling. After a minute, she stepped back and looked up at him, and the smile had stopped being held back. It was simply there, full and real, and transforming her face the way light transforms a room. "Cattle," she said. "Cattle." He agreed, and they sat back down and talked through the morning. June found out at breakfast. She came to the table still half asleep, reached for her biscuit, looked at her mother's hand, and went completely still. Then she looked at Elias, then back at her mother. Her eyes went very wide and very bright, and she pressed both hands over her mouth, and Adelaide said, "Don't make a spectacle." And June made a spectacle anyway, throwing herself across the table to hug her mother with an enthusiasm that knocked over the coffee, and then turning and doing the same to Elias, and saying into his shoulder, "I knew it! I knew it! I knew it!" in a fierce, muffled, entirely vindicated voice. "You didn't know anything," Adelaide said, righting the coffee cup. "I knew everything," June said. "I've known since the fence posts." "The fence posts," Adelaide repeated. "The very first ones, when he fixed them and you said he did good work." June sat back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone whose theory has been proven. "That's when I knew." Adelaide looked at Elias with an expression caught between exasperation and helplessness. He looked back at her with the same expression. It was, he realized, the first time they'd shared a look about their daughter without either of them meaning to, and the ease of it, the complete naturalness of it, was something he hadn't expected to feel so much. They were married in the spring. Walt Greer presided, having once served as a justice of the peace in a former life that he mentioned infrequently. The Sutter family came, and the Callaways who had had their baby, a boy strong and loud, and Margaret Fletcher arrived in a wagon driven by her grandson, and Jim Beaumont brought his wife and 3 daughters, and stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and cried without apparent embarrassment about it. The circuit preacher came through 2 days later and made it official in the eyes of the church as well, because Adelaide believed in covering all bases. June stood between them during both ceremonies, her hand in her mother's on one side, and Elias's on the other. And when the second preacher pronounced them husband and wife, she said clearly and without being asked, "It's about time," which made the assembled company laugh and made Adelaide close her eyes briefly in the manner of a woman asking for patience from sources beyond the immediate vicinity. The cattle came in June. 40 head of Beaumont's breeding stock, good hardy animals built for Colorado winters, and Elias spent the month of their arrival learning ranching in earnest from Beaumont's eldest hand, a taciturn man named Cal, who communicated primarily in single syllables and mild disapproval, and who told Elias at the end of the first week that he wasn't completely hopeless, which June reported was the highest praise Cal had ever extended to anyone. The work was hard in the way that the best work is demanding enough to require everything, and satisfying enough to make everything feel worth it. Elias rose before dawn and fell into bed after dark, and woke up the next morning ready to do it again, which was a thing he would not have believed about himself 18 months ago, sitting in the dirt at Cutter's Creek with a pistol and no reason to put it down. He thought about that day less than he used to. Not because he'd forgotten it or papered over it with better things, but because June had been right about something she'd said that first morning in the barn. Sometimes not stopping is how you find your way back to wanting. He had not stopped. And somewhere in the accumulation of days that followed, the wanting had returned. Adelaide was 3 months pregnant when the first railroad survey team came through the valley, and she met them on the porch with her hands on her hips and the deed in her pocket, and a manner that made the lead surveyor take his hat off without being asked. They staked their markers 200 yards west of the property line, which was exactly what Walt had predicted would happen once the Denver office understood what they were dealing with. The Western Consolidated Land Company sent a formal letter of apology that Adelaide read once filed and never mentioned again. "You're not going to gloat?" Elias asked the evening after the letter arrived. "Gloating is for people who weren't sure they'd win," she said, and went back to the accounts. He loved her. He had decided in approximately 900 specific ways, and that particular one was near the top. Their son was born in November during the first real snowstorm of the season, which Adelaide maintained was entirely appropriate given his subsequent personality. They named him Thomas Robert Croft. Thomas for Elias's brother Robert, for Adelaide's first husband, the two men whose absence had shaped the people who made him. June, who was present for the birth and handled it with considerably more composure than Elias did, declared him perfect and immediately began planning his education. "He's 6 hours old," Elias said. "It's not too early to start thinking about it," June said, holding her brother with the careful deliberateness of someone who takes new responsibilities very seriously. "He's going to need a strong foundation." "He needs to sleep," Adelaide said from the bed, already more herself than she had any right to be. "After," June said firmly, and began reading to the infant from the book currently in her pocket, which happened to be a primer on natural philosophy, because June's book selection was always a matter of what was at hand rather than what was strictly appropriate. Thomas proved to have his mother's stubbornness and his sister's curiosity, and something that belonged entirely to himself, a way of finding things funny that emerged early and remained constant. A particular laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine and made everyone in the vicinity want to be in on whatever had caused it. He was from the beginning exactly himself, which was the best thing a person could be. The years began to accumulate the way good years do, not marked by single dramatic events, but by the texture of ordinary days lived fully. The railroad came through in the spring of the 4th year of their marriage, and with it came people and commerce, and the slow transformation of the valley from isolated frontier to something that had more in common with the world beyond the mountains. They were ready for it. Adelaide had made sure of that, running her numbers and building her relationships and positioning the ranch with the same relentless practical intelligence she brought to everything. The beef contract with the railroad came through in the 2nd month of operation. Jim Beaumont shook Elias's hand at the signing and said, "Robert Hartwell would have loved this day," and Elias said, "Yes, sir," he would have, and meant it without complication, because he had learned over 4 years that loving the life Robert had left behind was not a competition with the man who'd built it, but a continuation of what he'd believed in. June left for school the fall. Thomas turned to boarding in town with a teacher during the week and coming home on weekends, and her absence created a particular shape in the household that nobody commented on and everyone felt. Thomas noticed it first, standing in the yard on the first Monday morning and looking at the trail she'd ridden down with the specific aggrieved expression of someone encountering an injustice for the first time. "June gone," he said with the economy of a 2-year-old and the weight of a philosopher. "She'll be back Friday," Adelaide told him. "Friday," he repeated, testing the word. Then he turned and went to find the cat, because 2-year-olds had limited tolerance for deferred gratification, and the cat was available now. Adelaide watched him go, with a smile that had some sadness in the edges of it, and Elias came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him, the way she'd learned to lean with the comfort of someone who has decided that needing support is not weakness, but accuracy about the nature of things. "She's going to be wonderful," Adelaide said. "She already is." "Yes. I'm proud of her." "So am I." She turned and looked at him. "You're allowed to say that you know. You've been her father for 4 years. You've earned the word." He had been careful about the word, conscious of Robert's place in June's history, and in Adelaide's heart, cautious about claiming something that had another man's name on it first. But he'd been present for 4 years of June's growing, the first book she'd finished alone, the first time she'd ridden without help, the morning she'd cried because a baby bird fell from the barn eave and couldn't be saved, and he'd sat with her in the dirt and let her grieve it properly, because that was what the moment required. He had been there for all of it. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I have." June came home that first Friday evening with 3 new words she'd learned, and a library book she'd been given special permission to bring home, and a story about a girl in her class who had a horse and had offered to let June ride it on Saturday. And the house filled up with her the way it always did when she walked through the door. Every room a little more itself, with her in it. At supper she looked between her mother and Elias, with that old assessing expression, the one she'd had since the beginning, the one that saw more than it was supposed to. "You're happy," she said. Not a question. Yes, Adelaide said. Both of you. At the same time. In the same place. June considered this with apparent satisfaction. Good. She reached for the biscuits. That's what I was hoping for when I found him. Adelaide looked at Elias. He looked at her. When you found me, Elias said slowly, you were hoping to make your mother happy. Partly. June spread butter with concentration. Partly I just didn't want to leave a dying man in the dirt. She glanced up. But partly yes. Mama was so tired. She was working so hard and never stopping and never letting anyone help, and I thought... She paused, thinking it through the way she always did. I thought if someone could just stay long enough to be useful, she might let herself rest sometimes. She looked at him levelly. You stayed. I stayed, Elias said, and she rested. June looked at her mother. Sometimes. Occasionally, Adelaide said in a tone that conceded the point without making a production of it. June smiled and went back to her supper, and Thomas threw a piece of biscuit at the dog, and Adelaide said his name in the voice that meant business, and the dog ate the biscuit, and the kitchen was warm and loud with the ordinary noise of a family at a table at the end of a day, and Elias sat in the middle of it and let it be exactly what it was. After the children were in bed, he and Adelaide sat on the porch in the cold autumn air, with the stars coming out one by one over the mountains, and she was wrapped in the quilt she'd made the first winter, and his arm was around her, and neither of them felt the need to say much. They had learned each other's silences, the way you learn a house, not all at once, but over time, room by room, until you knew which floorboards to avoid in the dark and which windows let in the morning light best. June said something to me last week, Adelaide said eventually. Before she started school, she said she paused. She said she remembered the day she found you. She said she'd been walking that trail for a reason, and she'd always believed that. Do you believe it? Adelaide was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines on the ridge. Down in the pasture, the cattle were settled shapes in the dark. I believe she walked out that day and found a man who needed saving, she said. I believe she brought him home to a woman who needed saving too, even though neither of them knew that part yet. She looked up at the stars. I believe what happened next was the result of choices. Yours and mine and hers. The choice to say yes when yes was terrifying. The choice to stay when leaving was easier. The choice to trust when trust had already been broken once. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she always looked at things she was being honest about. I don't know if that's destiny or just people doing the hard thing, but I know the result. What's the result? She reached up and touched his face with her calloused hand. The hand that had stitched his wound closed, and planted gardens, and signed legal documents, and held her daughter through grief, and rocked her son to sleep. The hand that wore his mother's ring smooth on its finger. This, she said. You and me, and those two in there, and this land, and this life. She held his gaze with everything she was, all the strength and the stubbornness and the grief she'd survived, and the love she'd chosen, and the woman she'd become. This is the result. Elias covered her hand with his and held it against his face, and thought about a man sitting in the dirt with a pistol, and no reason to put it down, and a barefoot girl appearing from nowhere, and a single word spoken in the dark that had changed every day that followed it. Yes, yes to the girl who refused to leave him. Yes to the woman who saved him when she had every reason not to. Yes to the fence posts, and the cold mornings, and the hard winters, and the work that never ended, and the life that grew from all of it stubborn and improbable and real. Yes to staying when every habit he'd built told him to run. Yes to being seen by people who looked at him and found something worth keeping. He had ridden out to Cutter's Creek to disappear, and instead he had been found. Not saved by grace or luck or anything he'd earned, but by a 10-year-old girl in bare feet who had looked at a broken man and decided with the absolute certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to believe in lost causes that he was worth the trouble of bringing home. She had been right. And every morning he woke up in the house on the ridge with Adelaide beside him, and Thomas down the hall, and June's books stacked on the kitchen table, waiting for the weekend. He knew she had been right. Some men spend their whole lives looking for the place they belong. Elias Croft had tried to leave his before he found it, and a barefoot girl had stood in the dirt at the end of a Colorado trail and refused to let him. That was the whole of it. The rest, the love, the land, the family, the life that had grown from those first impossible roots, was simply what happened when a man stopped running long enough to see what had been waiting for him to stay. And in the valley where the railroad would come, and the world would change, and new families would plant new roots in the same stubborn soil, the Hartwell Croft Ranch stood on its ridge and kept its cattle and raised its children and went on season after season, year after year, as proof that broken things could be mended, that trust could be rebuilt, one honest day at a time, and that the bravest word in any language, the one that opens every door worth walking through, is the simplest one there is. Yes,